World War II was the scene of incredible feats by its fighters, men and women, who defied adversity to bring their country closer to final victory. One of these people was the American sniper, Tony Stein. He not only stood out for his bravery and leadership ability, but for his mechanical skills. Thanks to these, he managed to modify a machine gun in the American arsenal until it became a true killing machine. It was not long before he became the terror of his enemies, being able to wipe out dozens of them in one go. But he also inspired the men who fought alongside him and ended up leading them to victory, even though the cost was very high. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Marine Tony Stein. Anthony Michael Stein was born on September 30th, 1921 in Ohio, United States. Due to the economic difficulties his family went through, he had to leave school and look for work to help bring money home. From a young age, Tony was fascinated with engineering and the way machines worked. These interests led him to join a machine shop, where he learned how to make tools, something that, although he didn't know it yet, would be extremely useful to him in the following years. He also worked as a tree cutter and in other construction roles. This, added to his love of boxing, where he won regional awards, led him to develop an imposing physique. In addition, his friends and family always spoke of his helpful personality and how he was always trying to help those he cared for. For all these reasons, it is not surprising that after the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, Stein joined the American forces. In mid-1942, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. Joining this group required great physical and mental strength, and only the most capable were accepted. But Stein went even further. He managed to join the Paramarines Division, one of Uncle Sam's elite units. He combined the amphibious training that all members of his corps received with parachute operations. The men who formed its ranks had to excel in combat on land, sea, and in the air. Only half of those who signed up were able to pass the final selection. It was not long before Stein was able to put into practice what he had learned during his training. By 1943, the Empire of Japan controlled practically the entire Pacific. From the hundreds of islands spread across the ocean to most of the countries in mainland Southeast Asia, miles and miles of territory were under its power. But while its conquests had occurred at a speed that surprised the Allies, by then the Japanese were already showing signs of exhaustion. They had not managed to achieve all their military goals, such as the defeat of China or the capture of air bases with which to threaten Australia, and their resources and men were beginning to run low. One of the main reasons that led them to find themselves in this state was the naval battle of Midway in 1942, where a large part of the Japanese ships were destroyed. Although they were still masters and lords of the Pacific, the advantage now belonged to the Allies. This is why the United States launched its great counterattack. One of these missions was Operation Cartwheel, perhaps the most pretentious of the Second World War. Its objective was to neutralize the important Japanese base in Rabaul, a city in Papua New Guinea. It was an ambitious plan, which consisted of moving island by island, eliminating the Imperial forces established there until reaching the final target. More trained soldiers were needed, and that is why the Marine Parachute Regiment, where Tony Stein was located, was called. Its first mission would consist of an air assault on Vella La Vella, one of the Solomon Islands. Once on the ground, they had to fight and take 2 vital airfields to prevent the Japanese planes from getting off the ground. Unfortunately for Stein, his directives changed at the last minute. His superiors decided that the resources needed to carry out these air assaults, such as transport aircraft, were not yet ready to come into play. Stein and his comrades were deployed as infantry, along with the rest of the Marines. But this did not mean at all that their training had been in vain. The battle lasted 2 bloody months, during which the Marine began to build his reputation. He always volunteered for the most difficult missions, and his comrades were inspired when they fought alongside him. In October 1943, the Americans managed to completely capture the island and moved on to the next step of the operation. The objective was now Bougainville, Papua New Guinea. Once again, an air attack by paratroopers was planned, but was scrapped shortly before the start of military action. Stein again joined the ground infantry units. During this engagement and several others in the Pacific Theater, the Americans were surprised by the unorthodox strategies of the Japanese troops. These ranged from suicide attacks, where the Japanese ran directly at enemy positions, through miles of tunnels that they used to infiltrate behind Allied lines. Another method used to catch the Americans off guard was that of Japanese snipers, who would set up shop in the tops of palm trees. There, camouflaged by the large leaves and with a panoramic view of the battlefield, they were able to kill dozens of soldiers before being shot down. Detecting them before the slaughter began was an extremely difficult task, but it was one in which Stein excelled.
Being a sniper or an expert marksman was no easy task. Only men like Stein could pull it off. Targeting enemies at long range, especially concealed Japanese snipers, required patience, body control, and more importantly, excellent rifle knowledge, be it a Springfield bolt-action rifle or an M1 Garand employing a scope.
In a single day of this battle, the American killed 5 enemy snipers before they could inflict significant casualties on his unit. After this, he became known as the sniper's sniper. His superiors, taking note of his talent, began using him in this position. His tasks were to defend his comrades from a covered position, seeking out and eliminating hidden Japanese. He performed his job perfectly. His excellence in combat continued throughout the Bougainville campaign, which ended its first phase with an American victory in late 1943.
For 4 weeks the battle raged, back and forth, up and down, attack, counterattack, retreat, advance, advance, until we killed more than 8,000 Japs. Our troops buried 5,370 of them.
But not all the news was good. The military high command had decided that the costs of parachute units within the Marines were not justified, and these groups were disbanded. Of course, this did not mean the end of fighting for Stein. The war was still far from over. However, due to the elimination of his combat group and the relative calm on Bougainville, he was allowed to return to his homeland for a few months. He used this time to not only continue training, but also to get married. After a short honeymoon, he returned to the military, joining the 5th Marine Division. For his exploits in the Papua New Guinea campaign, Stein was promoted to corporal and given the leadership of a squadron. He immediately began training them for the campaigns to come. By the end of 1944, Japan was slowly being pushed out of the territories it had conquered in the previous years. However, far from being intimidated by this, the Japanese fought ever more savagely. For them, the only alternative to victory was death. Their defeats always came at a very high cost in life, not only for Americans, but for the Japanese soldiers themselves. For these reasons, the Americans were always looking for new ways to improve their combat effectiveness. Stein, who, as we said at the beginning of the video, was very skilled in mechanics, along with other Marines, began to use his knowledge for this purpose. His goal was to get a weapon with a higher rate of fire, something they lacked in their ground equipment, but not in their airborne equipment.
It just so happened during the Solomon Islands campaign that there were plenty of Marine dive bombers laying around in kind of junk state. And it didn't take long for a few enterprising Marines to come up with the idea of removing an A&M 230 caliber air-cooled machine gun from one of the wrecked airplanes and then attempt to modify it for use on the ground as an infantry weapon.
Stein and his companions took this machine gun, which was used on the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers. This weapon was a variant of the M1919 Browning, one of the most widely used tools in military history. The modifications they achieved managed to increase the impressive rate of fire from 500 to an incredible 1,400 rounds per minute. In addition, they fitted it with the BAR machine gun's bipod to make it more stable, and the stock and sights of the M1 Garand rifle for greater accuracy. The end result was a devastating weapon, capable of sweeping away any enemy in its path. Only 6 of these machine guns were built, one of which was kept by Corporal Stein. It was named the Stinger. He managed to finish his invention just in time because the Americans would need every advantage possible for the upcoming battle. By early 1945, only a few islands separated Uncle Sam's soldiers from the Japanese mainland. For this reason, the Imperials were ordered to defend every inch of land, whatever the cost. Victory was no longer the goal, but the directives were for the enemy to lose as many men as possible before the Japanese were annihilated. One of these territories still in Axis hands was Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island located 1,200 kilometers from Tokyo. If the Americans managed to capture it, their long-range planes could threaten the Japanese capital from there. The Imperials prepared well to face the invaders, filling the area with hidden bunkers and tunnels that connected one end to the other. The actions began on February 9, 1945, with a naval bombardment by the Americans. The shells rained down non-stop for 10 days, shattering any defenses on the beaches. On the 19th of that month, seeing no response from the Japanese, the Allied High Command gave the order to land, but they had misjudged the situation. The Japanese had not been neutralized, but were waiting for them in their bunkers and tunnels. Stein, his squad, and the rest of the Marines landed safely on the black sands of Iwo Jima. No one fired on them for several hours. However, when the men had entered the beach, the fierce Japanese attack began. Camouflaged cannons fired on the massed troops, while machine guns opened fire from all directions. The American soldiers in the front were quickly annihilated, and those still disembarking ran the risk of being greeted by an artillery blast. Thousands died in just the first few minutes, and blood would continue to be shed in an atrocious manner, as these survivors recount here.
By the time we landed was several hours after HR. That's when the stuff hit the fan.
As you saw the sand kicking up, and explosions here and there, and there's a lot of fire all over the place. It was somewhat like the movies initially until you start seeing the red blood flowing. I realized then that this is what war was really all about.
Stein and his squad were able to take cover from the Japanese fire, but they knew that if they did not go in, they would eventually be cut down. When machine gun and mortar fire from a nearby bunker put his men at risk, the corporal bravely exposed himself to the defenders. He thus drew enemy fire, distracting them long enough for his comrades to eliminate the defensive position. His squad's orders were to destroy as many Japanese attack points as possible, and that was exactly what they did. Using their Stinger, the Japanese could do little to stop the Marines. Bunkers fell behind them. The modified weapons rate of fire was able to suppress the local front so that the remaining soldiers could approach the fortifications and mop them up. On that first day alone, more than 20 Imperial infantrymen were killed by Stein and his machine gun. For this brave action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the highest awards in the American Armed Forces, much later. But the campaign for Iwo Jima would continue for more than a month. During the following days, Stein continued to act with courage and determination. During one of these bloody battles, the Marine Squadron came under terrible enemy fire. Although his Stinger eliminated several Japanese, the fight lasted so long that his ammunition began to run low. Stein took off his helmet and shoes to gain more agility and ran to the beach to get more bullets. He did this not only once, but 8 times, always under Japanese fire. Even more admirable was that on each trip to the American post, he also carried a wounded man from his squadron keeping him safe from the Imperial guns. Thanks to this feat, Stein and his comrades managed to survive another day. On another occasion, he managed to direct the fire of a half-track vehicle that had lost its commander. On top of the transport, he was an easy target for the Japanese. Still, this did not deter him, and he continued to give instructions to the battleship's crew, while bullets flew around him. Miraculously, he received only minor injuries. Twice they managed to shoot him in the hands, taking away his personal machine gun. But Stein took it back and returned fire at the Japanese attack with his bullets. Later, seeing that the situation was desperate, the Marine covered his squadron with the Stinger until all his men were safe. He was the last to withdraw from the battlefield. On February 23rd, the Americans were ordered to capture Mount Suribachi, where the island's volcano was located. From this elevated position, the Japanese could rain artillery fire on the invading defenses, as well as having the ability to spy on their every move. During the battle that ensued when the Americans came into contact with the Japanese, Tony Stein was wounded, although not seriously. He was taken to a hospital ship, but his men fought on. The fighting culminated in an Allied victory and one of the most recognizable images of all of World War II. But despite the high morale that this achievement brought to the Marines, the fighting continued and never diminished in its brutality. During those days that Stein was recovering from his wounds, his unit encountered strong resistance. The defenses this time managed to overcome the American attack, and a large number of Marines fell under enemy fire. When he learned of the devastation suffered by his group, Stein defied the medics and left the hospital ship to rejoin his squadron. But this action would end up exacting a terrible price. On March 1st, 1945, Stein and 19 men under his command volunteered to locate Japanese fortified positions along the island's hills. They were slowing down the advance of an entire American company, so their elimination was of vital importance. But before they reached their supposed location, Stein was shot dead by an enemy sniper. Although he was evacuated and attempts were made to stabilize him, nothing could be done. The corporal died on the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. The Marines' exploits, however, inspired his squadron to the end. They were present when, on March 26, 1945, after a massive and unsuccessful suicide attack by the few remaining defenders, the island was declared secured. Although fighting with guerrilla groups continued for months, the battle for Iwo Jima was over. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater, with American casualties exceeding those of the Japanese. But despite the cost in men, it was one of the most important victories of the entire war.
The loss of Iwo Jima basically meant the end of the Japanese Empire. And now the Americans had a base to launch B-29 operations, basically unhindered all across Japan. The loss of Iwo meant the end of World War II for the Japanese.
After Stein's body was brought to the United States, he was buried in his hometown. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after the initial landing on the volcanic island, his widow was awarded his Medal of Honor. Her posthumous citation reads, "Courageous and indomitable Corporal Stein, by his aggressive initiative, sound judgment, and unwavering devotion to duty in the face of enormous adversity, contributed materially to the accomplishment of his mission, and his conspicuous valor throughout the bitter hours of conflict upholds and enhances the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what surprises you most about Anthony Stein's story? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.